I'm here with Dr. Ariel Rodriguez from the Department of Sports Management and Recreation. Ariel is an assistant professor in our department, has been at Springfield for 4 years now, 5 years,
I think we're going on 5 years now.
5 years. And I wanted to just bring him in today to talk a little bit about what sorts of things he's been dealing with, how he's been working through some of the challenges of the pivot to remote learning. And I wanted to talk to Ariel because he's someone who has come from a large institution to a small school like Springfield and has embraced the student contact he gets at the small institution, but at the same time also recognizes the value of online education and has developed some online courses as well. So I think Ariel is someone who is in a nice position to comment on both some of the challenges and benefits of both online and remote education. When you look at your courses now, we were talking before about some of the challenges you have in terms of the contact. Can you comment a little bit on that?
The contacts with my students.
Yeah.
It's well, first I want to start off by saying one of the things, especially moving from a bigger institution to smaller institutions, is recognizing just how important that contact is. And it's not to downplay that other institutions don't see it as important, but I think when you're in a smaller institution, these contacts, especially when we were in person, they don't just happen in those 15 minutes or 75 minutes. They happen when you go to lunch. They happen when you're walking to class. They happen in so many different spaces. They happen when you're sitting in your office, the students will come in, when you're outside just taking a walk. It happens in so many different spaces. And I think one of the challenges has been that with this contact is that now that we're being remote, it happens less frequent. It has to be much more coordinated, and it has to be an effort that has to be done. Otherwise, it's not likely to happen by happenstance, as may have happened when we were on campus.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that one of the things that we spoke of earlier is that there's this level of intentionality that has to be there if you want to maintain that contact, which, by the way, not only do faculty like you and I find really valuable, but the students really value that. And your comment about seeing them in lunch or walking across campus is interesting to me because I'm always impressed that the students, even if you don't see them, will go out of their way to say hi to us when they see us walking across campus, because they care about how we view them as individuals and how we're helping them sort of navigate this process of college. So I think that's a terrific point. Have you had any challenges as you've gone from the courses you were teaching to remote? And if you have, can you comment just a little bit on some of those?
I've had there've been a lot of challenges. I would say, but none that we haven't been able to deal with without communication and direct communication with students. So one of the biggest challenges initially was the assignments. And how do we break up now assignments that we had already come to an agreement initially in the beginning of the semester to do one way, then now we're going to do it differently. So for example, for my event management class, how are we going to deal with that? We weren't no longer going to be able to put on the events.
Yeah.
And so part of that was before we had left, I had a discussion with the students, and we agreed upon. We had discussion back and forth about what we were going to do with the remaining points, but the key was that we agreed upon something. So there hasn't really been any hiccups. And because I had experience with online education already, it was easier to put instructions in a way that students could understand. Now, it doesn't mean that I would write them perfectly all the time. I still get student emails and say, how do I submit this and how do I do this? But those are much more minimized, those potential issues. The other part too is that I do send them at least on a weekly basis. Anytime I do many major updates, I'll send those to my students. But each class is a little bit different and each one presents its own challenges. I've had, for example, one class that we were doing, an honors class that we were doing events. Now because we weren't going to be doing those events, we switched to a paper format to do different assignments. But because of that, now we had to transition to like, how do you write good papers? So we wanted to make sure that we did, when I did a Zoom class with them, we'd have a session where we just to talk about their outlines. And then before they started working on the paper, because that's just proper sort of way of helping them through that process. And then I was able to tell them, okay, well, that's that's extremely ambitious.
Mhm.
That's a really big topic. How about you just take a small part of this and then work with that? And most of the times that greatly benefit the quality of the paper, but it's important because you're pivoting now, you're shifting,
Mhm.
and you just have to recognize that there's best practices and different types of experiences that you want your students to have. So
Yeah, and that's great. And I like your distinction you drew between when it's an online course, because as I've talked about several places, and you and I have talked about, a fully online course is planned from the beginning for that purpose. And what we had to do here was, I have a friend, colleague from University of North Carolina who refers to it as emergency remote teaching. And that's kind of what we've been doing. I call it remote teaching. He put the emergency in front of it. But I think that that's what we've been doing. And I think that as we have those accommodations that you make when you increase communication to try to clarify things and then change things but continuously communicate, that's what's going to be most effective for our students. I think that piece right there really highlights some of the messaging that I really want faculty to hear, and that is, when you're in this environment, understand that when you go to class, you can communicate with your students 3 times, 2 times a week, pretty consistently, office hours, etc. When you're not, you need to consciously communicate with the students, or else they really don't know what's going on. And things that seem really clear to you often aren't quite as clear to students.
the other thing too is that it's important to be looking, because when you go online, we tend to have more contacts with the grades,
Hmm.
because a lot of times they because we don't have them in class, we'll do them online. But it's important to be looking at the grades as data,
Hmm.
and making sure that if you know that some students, like, they may just miss an assignment or something. I'll usually contact the student, especially if they have a pattern of being on time and things like that. Then I would ask them, so is everything going okay? Like, is something going on? So we can use those data points to also to determine and find out, maybe there's something going on. And I found out some very interesting things. And most of the times you know there's a lot of validity to it,
Yeah.
and not in the validity in the sense of like how we use it scientifically,
Yeah, no,
but
I hear you.
a lot of times it would say, I was going through something, or my child was this, and I just, I wasn't able to do this.
Yeah.
And so you can then work with them and address those earlier. But the other part that has been challenging has been the concept of lectures
Hmm.
and how to present that, because philosophically, in class, I view it as an interaction. So
Hmm.
we have this concept, this knowledge that's out there, and I'm trying to help us to come to work towards it. So not just me giving it to them, but working towards it. And it's much more challenging in an online setting. But one of the things too is that the amount of content also sometimes needs to be considered, because I may have taken a concept that was really important and spend uh, and a whole lecture on it in person, because I do assignments with it, and really have students engage with it and interact with it. Whereas if you do a video lecture, for example, that might have been just a few minutes worth of it. Now you can use other examples of it. So
Hmm.
content-wise, I have noticed that when I transition to an online format and do things, there's a lot more content that I tend to sort of to do. And I don't know, good or bad, but it tends to happen to me.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense because, as you said, and I've told faculty, I've had a lot of conversation with faculty about this, a 50-minute lecture that you give in class is not you talking for 50 minutes, because you're
Yeah.
getting feedback, even if it's, nonverbal feedback, you're getting feedback and you're pacing yourself as a function of what's happening. When
Mhm.
you're in the online or the remote environment and you're video chatting with students, you don't get the same cues and you don't slow down as much. So you can do in 20 minutes what might take you 50 minutes in the classroom. And that
Mhm.
kind of accommodation needs to be considered. I think that
Yeah.
that's a great point.
The other part too is about using I view different types of assignments
Mhm.
as tools. So, I mean, like if you're building a house, you need different tools to build a house, and I use the same way. And the part two, so for example, how I use discussions may be different, how I use reflections, how I might use bigger projects that bring in multiple weeks, how I use smaller assignments to pick at certain aspects of the class that I wanted to do and engage in. So it's also about being very strategic as to how we use these assignments, now that we're in an online setting, to continue that engagement, where students are engaging at different capacities, different levels, with different aspects of the class. And